So as people start to join in, I'll just do a quick microphone test so you'll be able to hear me. You'll be sure that your audio is working, and then we'll get started shortly. But thank you so much for being able to join us today for this year's Understanding Hate speaker panel. We're very excited to be joined by folks across Canada, and are really excited to just share and learn a bit more in the next hour and a few moments here. I do appreciate we're having people joining us from across Canada. So more later in the evening for some of us, and then earlier for some of us as well. But again, really excited to have folks be able to join us today. So we'll just wait a few more moments as people start to log in. Just for everyone's information and awareness, we are recording the session today, and we also will be sharing it afterwards as well, as we share this with the folks who have signed up, and also those that maybe signed up, but we know things happen, weren't able to join us in person or can only join us for a portion of it, and we'll make sure everyone has that information. So I'll get started. I'm really excited to have people join us today. My name is Irfan Chaudhry. I am the director of the Office of Human Rights, Diversity and Equity at MacEwan University, which is located in Edmonton, Alberta. MacEwan, located on Treaty 6 territory, and all university events are open with the following Treaty 6 territory land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land on which we gather in Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. The First Peoples' connection to the land teaches us about our inherent responsibility to protect and respect Mother Earth. We are reminded that we are all treated people and of the responsibility we have to one another. So again, I just want to welcome everyone to our annual event, Understanding Hate, building empathy, offering insight, and providing a platform for open dialogue. The Understanding Hate series explores the topic of hate and its impact on communities and diversity and inclusion. This year, our focus is on community responses to hate, and we're very thrilled to be co-hosting this year's event with the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. Just to note, this event is available in both English and French. To access the French channel, you'll notice on the bottom panel of your platform for Zoom, there's a globe icon that's marked as interpretation. Please click on that, select French, and you'll be able to log on to the French channel. So with that, I will now turn it over to Teresa Wu Pa, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation Board's Chair, to provide opening remarks again.
Thank you, Irfan. Hello and welcome to everyone joining us this evening for this great discussion. My name is Teresa Wu Pa, and I'm the chairperson of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Wati, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. 2021 has been a year of many firsts for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, but this first is one of which we are particularly excited about. This event is the first time CRRF is partnering with MacEwan University on their annual dialogue unpacking the topic of hate and its impact on diversity and inclusion in Canada. It is events such as this that strike at the core of what CRRF does. You see, CRRF traces its genesis to the reconciliation around one of the worst acts of racial discrimination in Canadian history, the internment of over 20,000 Japanese Canadians. It is the mandate of CRRF to work with the communities, government, and the private sector to bring about solution-oriented dialogue to ensure that what happened those 80 years ago will never happen again. Over the last 2 years, Canada has had to look itself in the mirror regarding handling hate in the physical realm and online. From the global protests around the murder of George Floyd, the physical and verbal harassments, as well as online hate suffered by Asian Canadians due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the attacks on Muslim Canadian women and families, the rise in anti-Semitism, and the discovery of mass graves at residential schools across our nation have forced us to look how well we are putting our values of justice, fairness, and inclusion to practice. Tonight's discussion is the beginning of a pathway to building bridges between communities. This dialogue aims to build empathy, offer insight, and provide an open and safe space for everyone to share their thoughts and the work that we need to do to eradicate hate from our society. We have speakers and experts from the Indigenous, Asian, Black, Jewish, and Muslim Canadian communities who will speak to the community's experiences, successes, and challenges in responding to racism and discrimination from a grassroots perspective. We will also explore the impact of intersectionality and experiences of racism through a cross-section of racialized and Indigenous groups, share community and systemic solutions to combating hate and racism. Like you, I look forward to this evening's dynamic and informative dialogue that you would apply your newfound knowledge to the important work within the communities across the country. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Amira, Elghaweby, CRRF's Director of Programs and Outreach, and our moderator for this evening. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for those remarks. Thank you, Irfan, for opening tonight's session. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Understanding Hate, Community Responses, a virtual event brought to you by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and MacEwan University's Office for Human Rights. Thanks to everyone who helped make tonight possible and who made the time to join us to hear this conversation. So I am coming to you from Ottawa, from the unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm very, very much looking forward to our discussion tonight, and I hope you will benefit from the panel of insightful and knowledgeable speakers. So please note that audience members can post questions to the Q&A, and we will have approximately 20 minutes at the end to address as many of your questions as time permits. And now let's get into all of this. So as many of you know, hate crimes and incidents have become all too common across various communities in Canada. The rise of social media, divisive identity politics in Canada and around the world, as well as a subsequent rise in misinformation and disinformation, has fomented hatred that continues to play out in dangerous and harmful ways. Today, we have gathered presenters from diverse communities to speak about the experiences of their communities in dealing with Islamophobia, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-Semitism. We will learn about the impact of racism in their communities and also be inspired by the unique and creative responses that communities have developed to combat hate and racism. So let me introduce you to our presenters. From the Sisters Dialogue, we have Wati Rahmat and Aisha Ali. From ACT to End Racism, AlphaEducation, Asian Canadian Educators Network, we have Genling Chang. The BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers, we have Leslie Varley, a human rights advocate from the Jewish community, Bernie Faber, and a dear friend, and BlackNorth from BlackNorth Initiative, we have Dahabo, Ahmed, Omer. So thanks to each and every one of you for making the time to join us. Your bios actually are very, very long, most of you, because of all the incredible work you've done. And I encourage folks to go and check out all the amazing work that you've done through the website. But for now, we're just going to dive right in. Let's start by exploring the problem first. And I'll begin with Wati and Aisha from the Sisters Dialogue. So let's begin with you, as areas in and surrounding the city of Edmonton have experienced a string of racial attacks in the past year against predominantly Black Muslim women. So let's just talk about what are the impacts of this type of phenomenon that's happening in your communities having on folks who are there.
Yes, thank you, Amira. So Muslim women, and especially Black Muslim women, have responded to these events with hypervigilance, caution, and fear that bleeds into their daily lives, and rightly so. Because these attacks occur at random with no specific personal ties, it not only directly traumatizes the victim, but it also vicariously affects any and every woman that identifies as a visible Muslim woman. And although these vicious attacks have occurred frequently this year, living in a state of stress isn't unfamiliar territory for Muslim women, and especially Black Muslim women. Microaggressions are common in not only marketplaces, medical facilities, workplaces, but also our schools, and our children are often exposed to these at a very young age, such as having your name constantly mispronounced, being followed in a store, not having your concerns taken seriously in the doctor's office, or being called slurs and comments that constantly make you feel unsafe in the communities that we exist in. So although these attacks are becoming more and more aggressive in nature, it only highlights the hate and intolerance that permeates our community at large.
Yeah, and thank you, Aisha, for highlighting the very real and raw feelings of Muslim women, especially our Black Muslim sisters here in Edmonton. Now, what people need to realize is that the problems of harassments and threats towards visibly Muslim women are happening at a higher rate than what is reported in the media. Through our work with Sisters Dialogue, we've had a number of women reach out to us to share their stories. And some of them are really scary, like being aggressively followed on the road and threats to their lives. And some of these, the women did report to the authorities, while others didn't feel comfortable or safe to report. And therein is the issue of underreporting. So we would like to see, the various barriers to reporting addressed, so that we can have a better understanding of the extent of the problem of Islamophobia here in Edmonton. As you can understand, being a victim of Islamophobia is traumatic in itself, and the burden on the victim to report and navigate the justice system and trying to find the support for themselves can be extremely overwhelming. So, and Sisters Dialogue, together with other organizations like ASAC, we've been having conversations with victim services, with 911 services, the city, and other agencies to try and address these gaps. But in the meanwhile, it is community grassroots initiatives like us that have to step up to meet the needs of victims. So Sisters Dialogue, we were created just earlier this year due to the ongoing attacks, because as Muslim women, we feel that we can better understand the issues affecting our sisters. And we want to ensure that issues like victim services and mental health are not overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Wati. So a lot to unpack in both your answers. And as we go around here to hear from each of our panelists, I think we're going to start to hear some common themes. So let's turn it over to Genling. Genling, in the past year, and as a result of the pandemic, there has, of course, been a sad and significant increase in anti-Asian racism. The attacks have also created a sense of fear in these communities. Can you describe other ways as well that communities have been impacted by acts of hate? Just you're on mute, Genling.
Thank you, Amira. I would like to respond to this question by actually looking at how anti-Asian racism functions. And when we understand how it functioned, we will understand the impact. It functions in a couple of ways: through stereotype tropes, through historical legacy manifestations of anti-Asian racism that's not well understood or well known, and because of erasure and absenteeism in being taught in schools, to the invisibility of how it is played out, the lack of data, as well as the lack of historical informed knowledge. I also like to situate this that in 2020, with COVID-19, I would call it a resurgence, because many people thought that was a year that marked the beginning of anti-Asian racism, but in fact it's a resurgence. Asian Canadian Educators Network decided to provide webinars to support Asian educators because of the number of emails and calls we have about how to cope with feelings of anti-Asian hate. I'd like to share this data because it's very telling. During the webinar, the first webinar, it is not empirical data, but it was a polling of 150 educators in attendance. And these are professionals, and these are undergraduates in post-secondary education. Very often what we hear with the good work of other community organizations are reported incidents. But here in the poll, we asked a couple of questions. One question was talking about racism. How comfortable or how prepared are you to talk about issues of racism that impact Asian Canadians? 46.91% said they are very uncomfortable. Asians themselves could not talk about it. That indicates the internalization of anti-Asian racism and the sentiments over time. 22.22% say they dare not talk about it because they feel they'll be stigmatized. Stigmatized as special interests, stigmatized as troublemakers, stigmatized in a whole number of ways. 16.05% say they have no knowledge or do not know how to respond. They lack the skills and the competencies in responding. And 14.81%, this is a very serious piece of data because these are educators probably talking from workplace incidents, said they fear reprisal. That is an indication of not just microaggression, it's systemic and it's structural. The next piece of question we asked, have you witnessed or experienced bias, discrimination, or microaggression? 89.23% of those attended say they did. 89.23% said they experienced systemic racism. And 75.38% say they experienced verbal abuse. So this data was staggering in October 2020. Data that unless we collect is invisible. So how anti-Asian racism is being played out is almost invisible, that including some of my colleagues and friends, when I raised the conversation, they were surprised when ACNet, AlphaEducation, Act to End Racism were responding and other community groups to address this resurgence. And some of them were surprised and said, why these webinars? We didn't think Asian Canadians experience racism. The second point I want to point out is how it plays out in stereotype tropes. This is a legacy of a historical legacy of a yellow peril on one end of the continuum and a model minority on the other. The yellow peril where Asians, whether it's a Komagatu Maru, whether it's a Japanese internment seen as enemy alien, whether it's a Chinese Exclusion Act, whether it's a 1907 commission that deemed Japanese and Chinese Canadians unfit for citizenship, gave rise to the yellow peril where we are seen as a threat, untrustworthy, disease carrier, and so on and so forth. And is carried and repeated in the 2015 SARS and again in 2020. The other end of the continuum is the Asians, and to a large degree, Asians is a big continent, to a large degree are painted with the idea of success. And their success is seen as white adjacency. And that is being used as a wedge against solidarity with other racialized groups. Those kind of experiences by Asian Canadians are painful, are deep, and they scar them psychologically and emotionally. It leads to the sense of being a perpetual foreigner, whether they're 2 years or recently arrived in Canada, accepted as a legitimate permanent residents and citizens, or their 4 or 5 generations of Asian Canadians. I think these kind of data and stories are very powerful, and I do not need to paint the harm it does to a country called Canada, where we believe diversity drives excellence, where we believe equity. And to some degree, it was these painful experiences, and to some degree, I would say the role of media and how anti-Asian sentiments and hate are being framed. There was almost a silence until the Atlanta shooting, no doubt not in Canada, where it was very noticeable by the Asian community when there was then a definite outcry beyond Asian community organizations trying to deal with the anti-hate and sentiments. So the question asks, just like George Floyd, just like the London shooting, just like the Atlanta, just like the defacing of synagogues and mosques, do we need this kind of incidents before there is a proactive as well as a reactive responses to social justice and equity and inclusion in Canada? These are pressing issues. I really truly thank CRRF and MacEwan University for bringing together different representatives for us to begin to talk about our stories that are often unheard, so that it deepens understanding and bring us to solidarity, rather than treating racism as a hierarchy and a competitive sport that divides us, rather than lead to a country that's really truly inclusive and really live up to the Multiculturalism Act that Canada is known for. I'm going to stop here. I will address your other questions at a later time.
Thank you so much, Genling. Thank you so much for all that context. And I think that certainly, you know, placing incidents of hate crimes, you know, acts of terror against our communities within that broader context is, of course, so important. And so when I turn to Leslie and we talk about Indigenous hate, where do we even begin when we know that decolonization and reconciliation are really at the forefront of the conversations right now? Where does the topic of hate even fit into the very important work that is already underway to bring folks to understand the ongoing traumas that are experienced within Indigenous communities due to the legacy of colonization?
Thank you, Amira. There's always been a specific intention to systematically dehumanize Indigenous people in Canada. The Indian Act was created in 1876, and it still exists as the original act of apartheid. It's the only race-based act that we know of in the Western world. Through it, Canadians have defined us as uncivilized and set about to make us out in their European image. And when that didn't work, they tried to get rid of us through starvation, neglect, disease, illness, death. And that was just in the form of residential schools. The contemporary version of this practice is the child welfare system, which discriminates to this day against Indigenous children. Today, this very day, Canada is refusing to pay the same child welfare rates to Indigenous children as they do to other children. Why? We continue to pay for our existence with destruction of our land, our bodies, our children, our culture, and our very lives. Indigenous specific racism and hate impacts us in every aspect of our lives in the so-called justice and education sectors, and as I said, in the child welfare system, as examples. You're all aware of the discovery of the unmarked graves, Indigenous children in residential schools. We've known about these for years, and nobody paid attention to our stories until we actually provided the evidence. Where else in this country is the outcome of hate so horrifically prevalent than in the thousands of unmarked graves of innocent children? The focus of all this hate towards us has, of course, been intentional, with the goal of removing us from our land in order to maintain the myth that the land was never ours in the first place. Eurocentric misogyny has been particularly harmful to our women. We have been framed as dirty, promiscuous, diseased, drunken, unfit mothers who don't deserve our children. And you've recently learned that we have white women among us pretending to be Indigenous, using us to get ahead in their careers, driving their perception of an Indigenous agenda, while using incredibly damaging stereotypical descriptions of our people, drunk, violent, and chaotic, to describe her alleged Indigenous upbringing. Tragically, genuine Indigenous women are not considered worthy of a search if they're reported missing. Police systemically ignore violence against Indigenous women and girls. We are then targeted, knowing that the police are not protecting us. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry is an example of just how much we are hated and how much we are despised. And there's no external pressure on government to address this documented tome of hatred towards Indigenous women and girls. And to this day, we continue to fight for the rights and inclusion that new settlers are granted and for what colonizers have taken for their own. For Indigenous people, Racial hate, white supremacy, and misogyny have been killing us since European contact. And I want to leave you with this thought. This Indigenous specific racism and hatred is what the foundations of this nation of Canada are built upon. And we really need to start, I think, from there to come to a place of reconciliation. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Just, you know, it's so heartbreaking to be learning and unlearning all that has been taught to many of us, and not being more aware and understanding of the realities that you just described. And so thank you so much for sharing this with us tonight. Bernie, if I may bring it to you. Now, you're, of course, have been a very, very strong advocate on issues of anti-racism and hate and anti-Semitism, being so rooted, obviously, in the Jewish Canadian community, as well as just being such a loud and important proponent of standing up against hate. And, you know, we work together at the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. You're the chair of that organization, monitoring hate groups since 2017. You know, what over the years and up until now, what have been some of the common themes that you have seen in terms of the rise of white nationalism, and specifically how these groups promote anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of hateful ideology against minority communities?
Thank you, Amira. And let me just start off by saying that hate is really visceral. All of us here on this panel have felt hate in some form or another. It has impacted us all differently. I acknowledge that my white skin, for example, has given me privilege over many years here in Canada. But I can also say to you that, you know, growing up in a small town, as Ottawa was when I grew up, as the only Jewish child in my public school, I felt anti-Semitism literally every day. And I was actually brought up in what I would call the shadow of genocide, a shadow of the Holocaust. My late father was the sole Jewish survivor of his village in Poland, of 750 Jews, including his wife and children, brothers and sisters. I understand this pain, and it has followed us literally. Well, Robert Wistrick, a well-known historian, has called anti-Semitism the longest hatred. But again, all of us understand what that means, because anti-Semitism is just on the same wheel of racism and extremism. If you are an anti-Semite, you are anti-Indigenous, you are a racist, you are anti-Black. You are a homophobe and an Islamophobe. They're all cut from the same cloth. The problem, and Leslie has sadly identified it well, as has Genling and others, the problem really is, so where do we go from here? How do we deal with this? How do the bad guys actually continue to promote this, and yet Canadians continue to turn a blind eye, unless, of course, as Genling mentioned, that there is an episode or a terrible situation, as it has happened in the Quebec City Mosque, has happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue, has happened in London, Ontario. Then all of a sudden, boom, our attention is diverted to this. But let's understand, police have reported, and this is the last set of stats that we have from Statistics Canada in 2019. Police reported a grand total of 1,946 acts of hate in 2019. But Stats Canada, through the general social survey, has shown that self-reported cases of hatred number 223,000. 223,000. Somewhere we're missing the boat. And I believe that we're missing the boat because many people just don't understand the visceralness, the actual emotion of hatred itself. It destroys from within and it destroys from without. So the kind of work that we're doing here today is absolutely essential work. You ask Amira, how does the promotion continue? How does it happen? Well, in the old days, when I say the old days, I started this work, and before this, I was a social worker actually in Ottawa for almost a decade. But in 1984, I came to Toronto to work with the Canadian Jewish Congress. In those days, the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists and the white nationalists would stand at the corner of Yonge and Bloor, and they would hand out leaflets, terrible racist leaflets. People like Ron Gostick and John Ross Taylor, of course, the names of Malcolm Ross and James Keekstra, those were the old statesmen of anti-Semitism. And if 1 or 2 people, if 10 people took those leaflets, that was considered a pretty good day. Today, it's a lot easier. Social media has become the tool of choice for hate mongers. So now all you have to do is have a Facebook account, or have a Twitter account, or do TikTok, which I know very little about, although my adult kids seem to enjoy it a lot. Those have become the tools that are used. And with the flick of a key, you can potentially reach not 10 people, not 100 people, but tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. So let us just say out of those thousands of people, 5 or 10% really glom on to the message. That's all you need. We're talking about, in Canada alone, if you take a look at the numbers that voted for the People's Party of Canada, 8%, 10%, that's almost 3 million people who are prepared to accept racism into their lives. So the promotion is not a problem. There is the passive, subtle promotion that we see online, and then there is, of course, the aggressive promotion, as we saw in places like Charlottesville, where 250 neo-Nazis with tiki torches marched down the main street of Charlottesville, passing synagogues and screaming at the top of their voices, "Jews shall not replace us. Jews shall not replace us." This is in 2019. It's 2021 and very little has changed. And so the question that I think we're going to have to struggle with today, this evening, and we're not going to answer this question, but we have to struggle with it, and it will be a continuous struggle. How do we get leaders to lead? How do we get leaders to listen? We've been working on online hate legislation now for well over 10 years. Every government, and it doesn't matter if it's an NDP government, provincially or federally, a liberal government, conservative government, have all said, yes, we need this. And yet they talk the talk and they have yet to walk the walk. We have work to do, my friends. And I thank CRRF for bringing us all together, the MacEwan University for the work that it's doing. And I look forward to continuing our discussion this evening.
Thank you so much, Bernie. My count for the PPC was about, is it 800,000 votes? When you said 3 million, I started like sweating. I think
it wasn't. It wasn't the votes. We're talking about the percentage of people that were prepared to vote for them, right? Yeah, they received a bit around 8, but even 800,000. I mean,
it's
think of that.
But
800,000 Canadians.
Of
right.
course. Oh no, of course. But and hopefully that will change with the work that we're all doing together. Next election,
let's hope so.
Let's keep working for that and having that sort of bright optimism about the future here. But okay, so I'll just like to welcome Dahabo and ask you, Dahabo, we know that Black communities in Canada are experiencing also very high rates of hate crimes according to Statistics Canada. And this is only what is being reported, again, by police. And we just heard from Bernie about the gross underreporting of hate in this country. How would you describe the state of hate right now and how it's impacting on Black Canadians?
So thank you, Amira. And I want to thank the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and MacEwan University for having me today. And it's really nice at times to go last, and I'll tell you why, because you almost get an opportunity to just hear the thoughts of everyone. And I wanted to just maybe take a moment to say thank you for everyone who's gone before me, just restructuring what hate actually means. We've seen and heard about a certain definition of hate. Sometimes it's too narrow. It's calling someone the N-word and whatnot. But I think the way that we've defined it so far tonight has been really enlightening for me. I've taken a step back from my own speaking points and I wanted to say something completely different than what I initially anticipated. So I'm going to be improvising for the next few minutes, but I I am where I'm saying to myself, hate doesn't just come about, right? We give hate oxygen, we give it life, we give it definitions in terms of why we don't like someone or why a certain group is not deserving of humanity or deserving of love or deserving of care or equity or prosperity or success in this world. And Black communities, very much like Asian communities, Indigenous communities, and Jewish communities, and Muslim communities, and I represent 3 of those communities right here tonight. But it tells me that we are now at least saying to ourselves that hate doesn't just come about. And so I'm going back to my own thoughts around how did we get here? How did we get to a place where people can openly hate, comfortably hate, and there's no repercussions, there's no consequences, nothing really happens. And so if the question to me ultimately is, you know, what is the state of hate for Black Canadians? I think it's pervasive. And I think we've reached a point now where anti-Black systemic racism has reached new heights in a new degree, and it's impacting our communities deeper than it ever has. And when I think about just the amount of challenges and barriers that Black Canadians have been facing for generations, and then we have the collide of COVID-19 and that the tension rising above and beyond, you know, the Black experience in Canada is dire. You know, when we think about Black students who are 4 times more likely to be expelled from Toronto high schools. And I say Toronto because 0.5 million of Black Canadians live in Toronto, right? When I think about Black university graduates who have incredible education levels, but get paid 80 cents to the dollar. These are ingredients that formulate hate. We may not think about it, but when we sit back and say to ourselves, why is it that 20% of Black residents in Toronto are 20 times more likely to be shot dead than other Canadians? That's a form of hate. That doesn't just come about. It's something that percolates. It's something that's done systematically. It's something that we know is happening, but we're doing nothing about it. And so the state of hate and anti-Black racism specifically is so greatly high right now. And I think about the 1.2 million Black people that are here, when 1 out of 30 Canadian is Black, and in Toronto it's 1 out of 11, I believe. And then we're overlooked because we're put into this visible minority community, right? And so when I think about how do we confront anti-Black racism, because I truly believe, and I'll say this publicly, and I've said it publicly before, that if we're able to deal with anti-Black racism systemically, that the hate that Black communities face will automatically be impacted. And I say that with all of my belief. When we know that systemic bias are impacting Black communities on the educational front, when there's a reduced likelihood of Black Canadians succeeding in job opportunities, when there's an impaired career progression, when there's inferior access to healthcare, when there's racial profiling and bias in policing, there's all these, when you look at every single sector, Black Canadians are being impacted. And so for me, all of these things that are happening really do define hate, because, you know, it can't be just slurs. It can't just be online hate. Hate to me is that, and then so much more. It's how we treat a community within our society. How do we integrate them? Why aren't we looking at the worst, the educational outcomes or performances of Black students? Why aren't we looking at the impacts of policing for Black kids and Black youth? Why are we not looking at the fact that 3% of the kids that are labeled gifted are Black, even though they only represent 12% of the educational systems? What does that tell you? Is that we have incredible people within our communities, but they are neglected, they are pushed aside, they are overlooked, and unfortunately that means that they don't exist, and there's a massive erasure of our community. And so I think hate is yes, it's you know, it takes love there. I also believe it takes like deliberate and intentional, and really you know, there has to be a rise of us standing up. And I love this conversation because I think it's giving us a different frame of how we look at hate. And again, I really thank the folks that went before me, because I think you gave me a moment to think about how I define hate in myself and for myself, because hate is not just the typical slurs and the typical things that people say online, because we've seen that time and time again. It's this systemic and structural framework that has been built to literally erase a community. that is hate to me. That's how I'm defining hate now. And so, look, I want to say way more, but I know we have a big conversation as we go. So thank you, Amira, for giving me some time.
Thank you so much, Dahabo. And absolutely, I'm very conscious. I think we're all conscious here of how this conversation is going, that when it comes to the hate crimes and hate incidents, they're the symptoms of the disease, right? This is the issue at hand, is that there is the underlying real systemic issues in our communities, that we are talking about hate crimes and hate incidents because, as has been said, hate crimes are message crimes. So when they are happening all around us, they do get sometimes attention. They're not only targeting that individual, but if it gets beyond that individual, if people hear about it, that the entire community or communities are impacted by that information, that it will actually, studies have shown it will actually change people's behavior and their ability to feel that they can go about their day-to-day lives in the way that they were accustomed to before that hate had occurred. So we talk about hate incidents and hate crimes because, again, it's that very visible manifestation of, all of the underlying and just as crucial, if not the most crucial aspect of how systemic barriers are keeping folks back. And I actually want to point out that today the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, along with Environics, released a study that looked at how communities are feeling about the state of racism in Canada right now. And it's not very surprising, but it makes us all, of course, pause, because more and more people within our racialized communities, in particular Indigenous communities, Black communities, are feeling more and more pessimistic, not because more is necessarily happening. We know that racism has been going on and continues to persist, but as we start to peel back these layers, and it's really hard to sort of balance talking about the problem, but ensuring that we also talk about a solution so that people don't feel overwhelmed with this information. Because at the end of the day, we do want to encourage people and create the right conditions that everyone, regardless of their characteristics, their racial backgrounds, are able to fully participate. So it's a very difficult thing. And so that's where we're going to shift the conversation now, because each and every one of you, it's not only about outlining the problem as you've done so very eloquently tonight, but it's also thinking, okay, well, what are some of the solutions? How are we going to move beyond this? How are we going to ensure that folks are not stopped in their tracks and not able to continue to participate in society in the ways that they want to? So let's talk about then the specific responses that each of you and your communities have undertaken to provide support to those who've been impacted by racism, and also the tools that each of your communities have created as part of your anti-racism strategy. So we can have a little bit more of that sharing and that ability to sort of imagine other solutions that we may not have thought of for our own communities. So Leslie, if I can start with you, your organization has taken a very unique approach in addressing racism in the health sector, for instance. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you've been doing that?
Sure. What we've done is we have worked with the amazing doctors Alika and Kamea LaFontaine, proud Albertans, who have developed an app for us to put in our complaints, our racism experiences within the health sector. And we're piloting this app in BC in our 25 friendship centers. And it is a safe place for Indigenous folks to record a racism experience. It's a fully anonymized app, meaning that our identities are protected. And this, along with it being Indigenous, is what makes it safe for us. And since we've launched the app in November of last year, we've had over 6,000 complaints on the app, which I am guessing is more complaints about Indigenous specific racism than the entire country has ever experienced. It's a staggering number for us. And we know that the health sector complaints process are going to protect their own people. They're going to protect the doctors and the nurses and the orderlies who we are making complaints about. We only need to look at some historical events like Mr. Brian Sinclair in the Winnipeg Regional Hospital, who sat there and his body was in rigor mortis when another patient finally recognized that he had died and alerted the healthcare providers. And then very recently, the late Miss Joyce Echequan, who had healthcare providers saying horrific things to her while she lay dying. These examples of death due to racism are rare when they make the media for Indigenous people, but in my previous role, we created the SANYAS, Indigenous Cultural Safety Program, and we received thousands and thousands and thousands of examples of horrific racism in the health sector. So this app needs to be outside of the healthcare sector because the healthcare sector protects itself. And our intention on this app is to report out annually on the racism experiences that we have and to be able to track those so that we can look at regional hotspots of racism. We already know where they are, but this is going to give us the evidence to tell us exactly where these hotspots are. And for Indigenous people, it's never safe for us to make complaints within the mainstream sector. We don't even bother to report any microaggressions, but even the bigger racialized experience and stuff, we don't dare report because in some cases we only have access to one doctor or one hospital, for example, and we're worried that we're going to lose those services if we make any complaints about it. And I have certainly heard those threats, even coming from healthcare providers in the healthcare system. And so those are very real experiences for us and they're very real threats. So we don't complain inside the system. And when we do complain, those complaints are minimized or they go unanswered, or we risk losing our services altogether, or in some cases, having the police called. Even I recall sitting in the hospital with my nephew who had a very, very serious condition and was triaged the last person, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Who went into intensive care for 5 days after they finally got to see him. And when he gently got up to go and ask when the doctor might see him, he got shouted at to sit down, that the doctor was very busy. And I was very worried for my nephew because I felt like probably the next step would be for the intake person to call the police. And so it's because of those experiences that I think that we need to have a complaint system external to the healthcare system. And so we are so pleased to be working with this app with Dr. Alika Lafontaine and Camilla Lafontaine. And we're so taken by the numbers of complaints, of racism complaints that we've had on the app since we soft launched it a year ago.
Wow, that sounds phenomenal, Leslie. I mean, 6,000 complaints on this app in just a year. It's telling. It's telling. Again, not surprising, but certainly very important way. Third-party reporting is certainly something I know that people are talking about in different communities. So thank you for that, Leslie. Bernie, I know the Jewish community, as you said, the longest hatred has had to figure out ways to ensure that the rise of anti-Semitism and hate crimes targeting Jewish communities are being reported and being addressed. And in fact, one of our audience members is even asking a question around, trust issues with police. And so when the Jewish communities have worked to try to ensure that people are reporting what's been happening, how has that been for people?
Well, I wish I could say it's been terrific. It absolutely hasn't. Listen, the track that I've taken as a leader in the Jewish community and now with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network is identify and confront, and to actually work with civil society, even though it's very difficult to work with civil society. There was a time when within the police services, there were actually anti-hate units where police officers were trained by members of the community, amongst others, to identify hate, to be sympathetic, to be empathetic, to understand it. That's no more. That doesn't exist anymore. And what I hear, and listen, it's much easier in many respects for the Jewish community to report hate to the police. They don't have the same fears as you find in the indigenous community or in the Muslim community or in the Black community. And yet even our community that has been, we have a lot of the privileges that other communities don't have. When it comes to police, they just don't seem to act. It's like they have to be pushed all the time. And the example that I give, at least in the last year and a half now, is the example of the Muslim gentleman whose name, unfortunately, I forgot to mark down, in Rexdale in Toronto, who was murdered by what we found out to be a member of a neo-Nazi death cult. The man was arrested. We gave, and when I say we, I mean the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, gave the police all the information needed to not just charge this man with murder, but that it was a hate-motivated crime. And when people say to us, well, he's been charged with murder, what more do you want? We want him to be charged with a hate-motivated crime. We need to be able to demonstrate to society that these crimes are not simply, done as somebody shooting somebody in the street, as tragic as that might be, but actually this man went and targeted a Canadian Muslim and slit his throat. In London, Ontario, a young man took his truck and drove it into a Muslim family, and wiped them out. In Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a neo-Nazi knowingly walked into a synagogue to murder Jews. We have to be able to understand that there's motivation behind all this, and we need to get to work with our police. Now, there are many people out there, especially many of my friends in the Black community, who say, we have to start taking a look and understanding that the police are not really there to help us. That may be so, but we have to turn that corner. We have to turn that around. It's our responsibility as members of minority communities that are being targeted to push the police, to push the government, to push security services. That is what we must do. And so for the Jewish community, very often what we have done is, we've taken the law into our own hands. So what do I mean by that? When Ernst Zundel, a notorious Holocaust denier of the 1980s, began his spree of Holocaust denial, we ended up taking him to court. We push police to actually lay charges. And I'm telling you, it is like pushing a boulder up a hill. But if we get 10 or 15 or 20 other people with us together pushing that boulder up the hill, sooner or later, they're going to listen. And that is our job. That is what we have to do as a collective, is to get civil society to understand that this is also an epidemic. Hate is also a virus that needs to be addressed. No matter the color of our skin, and no matter the God that we believe in, we have to work together. And it's a long game, my friends. It's not a short game.
Yes, thank you for that. And it was Mohammed Aslam Zafis.
Thank you. And I'd like to recognize his name in memory and honor of this man who really stands for us as an example of the need of the work that we have to do.
Absolutely. And just to further point about the hate crimes unit. So even here in Ottawa, we had a very interesting, I'll be very quick, a very interesting episode where we had one of the oldest hate crime units. Bernie, you gave me the history lesson on this. And somehow a few years ago, that hate crime unit disappeared, and the police said, we never had a hate crime unit.
I remember.
And there was the vandalism against a Black family's home. And the Black community here in Ottawa was like, well, where's the hate crime unit? And due to the advocacy of the Black community here in Ottawa and others who said, we need that hate crime unit reinstated, now there is a dedicated unit in Ottawa. And to the participants' question also about online reporting of hate, we also now have advocated for online reporting of hate here in Ottawa so that people don't have to show up at the police station, which can be very intimidating and uncomfortable, or call police to show up at their home, because many community members are not comfortable with having police show up at their door and parked outside their door. It's very stigmatizing for folks. So just to address that. So again, community advocacy and coming together to create that mobilization around getting these issues addressed is so critical. And so maybe I'll shift a little bit now to Dahabo. The BlackNorth initiative, which has been doing some really incredible work. I saw your recent launch around supporting Black youth and employment and all this really important initiative that are happening to support diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplaces. Maybe if you talk a little bit then about, again, that systemic piece, what are the best practices and programs that organizations can adopt to then start to also work more at that systemic level that has been addressed to address discrimination, but then also to encourage that full participation that we're all looking for?
Yeah, you know, I think the secret ingredient to this really incredible sauce called the BlackNorth has been unity. I can tell you that mobilizing corporate Canada has been the one thing that we have done since day one that has allowed for some of this most, life-changing, groundbreaking, creative, innovative, transformative programs that we've launched. And that's because we're not alone. And I say that with all the humility and grace in the world that we have a lot of experience, we have a lot of skill sets, we understand the issues deeply, but there has to be this idea that unity is key, and that there's such a power in our numbers. And so bringing in 500 CEOs, and I say that because it's leadership, because it's accountability, and because it allows for a top-down approach in a good way, so that we can see that we're leading by example, right? And so if we take a position to say to ourselves that we are going to build something that can be led properly and that can be developed in the way that it needs to be, then you start to see these programs and initiatives that are conducive to the realities that we're facing. And so at BlackNorth, being able to bring 500 CEOs together from across the country that represent hundreds and thousands of people, and that represent $1.3 trillion of the market cap, that tells you the impact it has. And so, I think the programs we've built have been ones where we were very deliberate and intentional about what are the barriers. And I can tell you, and I wish I can almost paint a picture of what our war rooms look like, but we sit there and bring as many stakeholders as we can. And so we're very, very generous with our time, because I think it's important to give voices to those who have not had a space in the past. And so we have these working sessions where we bring groups together and we put on the wall, like, what is wrong? What is not functioning? And we make it a commitment. Every time we walk into these rooms, we make a commitment. We set our intentions right at the get-go, that everything that goes on that wall gets resolved. If not, we're not walking out. And it can make for long meetings. But there is this, and I say this all the time, but there's like a behavioral shift that needs to happen. Some of the best practices that we have seen really function really well is this conversation about, let's you and I talk, let's have a one-on-one conversation. What is it that is innate or inherent, or that we have learned as we were growing in the society, that allows us to believe that what we are in now is okay when it isn't? Now, we have seen a murder that was televised a little over a year ago. And can I say today that we are where we need to be, even though millions of people around the world watched it? No, we're not there yet. And so what is it going to take is what I ask myself. And I think what it's going to take is this deliberate, consistent unification between our communities. And so when you see programs like our scholarship program that we just launched, and the idea behind it is, we were putting all these barriers on the wall, we realized there's barriers at the onset, right? And unfortunately, Black people right at a young age are taught that they're not good, Literally, that is the story that we are told, unfortunately. And so we talked about what it means to grow up in the educational system. We talked about what it means to get out of the education system and graduate, what it means to go in the job market, what it means to stay and grow in the job market, what it means to buy a home and be economically and economically empowered and stable. We talked about all these things, and we built a program that starts at grade 10 with a mentorship and internship opportunities from grade 10 to 12. Grade 12, we actually sit there and help you draft your application for post-secondary education, right? And then we make sure that you get the references you need, you get the grades that you need, you get the mentoring and the sponsorship that you need, all in grade 12. And then you go to school and we pay for tuition. And part of that tuition is not just, getting your courses paid. It's your books, it's the activities that you may do, it's all of these things that are barriers, and these are all the things that wall. because we had so many voices at the table. And so I think what makes us unique, and I think everyone has to have that unique voice because it's important that we address all of them. But I think what brings us to the space where we bring in a particular lens is that we're able to mobilize and bring as many communities together to then deal with what are these challenges and how do we make sure that we commit and make a decision that every single barrier has a solution. So when you have this child who starts at grade 10, goes to school, gets education paid for, they get the support they need, they grow, and then they get sponsored into a role at the end of their 4-year schooling. That's all the barriers have been addressed, right? And I think so that those are some of the best practices that I think function is making commitments at leadership levels, making sure that you can be honest about what the barriers are, and understanding that progress is progressive. Like I say this all the time, it's not going to happen overnight. But I can tell you that when I see that cohort, the first cohort of our students who are going to graduate and get into the job market and feel empowered and uplifted from grade 10 all the way to starting a career, that is progressive, but it's progress. We've now moved into doing this work a lot differently, right? So look, I could sit here and tell you about the 6 or 7 other programs we've got going, but the intent, the spirit behind my message is that we have to do it together. We can't do it alone. It won't work. It hasn't worked. So let's not try to do that again.
That's, of course, absolutely. I'm sure like everyone is nodding here on the panel. Absolutely. Like we have to be able to share with each other and learn from each other's experiences and support and amplify the work. Genling, if I may turn to you and ask, how are advocates within Canada's Asian communities working in solidarity to combat racism?
Referring back to my first response to the initial question, I would say I will not be able to speak for all the Asian community organizations, but looking at the work of ACNet, ACCT, Asian Canadian Educators Network, Act to End Racism, and AlphaEducation, I think we looked at what are the strength-based, what are the roots of those kind of what is causing the invisibility, what is causing the amplification of dehumanizing stereotype tropes that dehumanize Asian people, what are the barriers they face. So we find that it's like Dahabo said, we have to be very intentional. The work is very complex and very intentional. So I want to talk about addressing it in public education and school system. And the target audience is at all groups, all age groups deserve attention. They are not neglected, like Act to End Racism have online incident reporting, public awareness, community outreach, and so on. But a special focus on the youth for a couple of reasons. It's proactive, it's sustainable, it's future forward-looking. If each generation we grow young generations of Canadians who have deeper, more thoughtful understanding of how racism divides us, we reach somewhere closer and closer. And when we talk about the work of anti-Asian racism, it's not done in the absence of the other Islamophobia, anti-indigeneity, anti-Blackness, or anti-Semitism. So some of the work we do is 3 areas: capacity building, especially with educators. Educators play a big role in the success and well-being of students. So the well-being factor also then leads us to the interconnection between school and public health, especially with mental health and trauma, and a lot of the manifestations of Asian youth would be in the area of well-being that hold them back from being successful. The other thing we realized that if you take and you look at, say, election voting, Election Canada, you ask the question, why are young people not electing? Because they feel disenfranchised. They feel a sense of hopelessness. They don't feel they belong. So to re-engage them into civic responsibility, civic engagement, and civil leadership, we look at leadership training. So there's leadership training at all levels, because like CPAC just released a leadership report on the representation of Asians in executive leadership is minimal. They look at the justice sector, the education sector, the health sector, and so on. And in proportion to the population, it is really alarming. So who is at the table matters, but leadership starts at very young age, at the youth. So there are programs that, for example, Act to End Racism have youth leadership program on civic leadership. AlphaEducation had created webinars for youth, where the webinars is not just Asian youth, it's very much like today, we have a cross-section of youth coming from various racialized population. And they are given a forum to talk about the racism they feel, they hear, and they see. And the most important question we ask them is what the role of youth, what will be the role of the older generation, and what's the role of the government. From there, they begin. We also work with schools where we develop inquiry projects that enable young people to connect school learning with community learning, one of which is the Shadows of Racism, Voices Unheard, the AlphaEducation launch. And when we work with the school, we provide workshop for young people with teachers present. And when teachers are present, they are also professionally being developed. And the emphasis is developing historically relevant. So how do we bring back the absence and gaps in knowledge on historical systemic racism in Canada? But that understanding is then also coupled with who are our heroes and models in Canada. So we bring up who in the Black community you know as heroes in science, where is the contribution from Islam civilization, what are the contributions of the Indigenous people and the Jewish people, and so on and so forth. So when we begin to look at contributions as well as the struggles, as some of the grade 12 students say, they're so tired of the story of the Black people that end and begin with slavery. We are more than that. We want our curriculum to be more than that. We are tired of seeing the Chinese as being railroad workers. We want to know more and beyond that. So we bring that in, and one of the amazing work is when they develop a question, they interview a member from any racialized community, they develop a video, and they do a storyboarding. And it's transformative as Dahabo so because they come up and you see those videos like Stolen Lives, Stolen Stories, where they interview a young Indigenous student, and the two girls are Asian, and they begin to be able to tell the stories. If they are able to tell the stories, they develop empathy, they develop humanity, they develop what it means to be inclusive. They begin to canvas for the support of the Red Dress Project, the missing women and Indigenous women. They know the data, they could talk about it, they could engage in actual discourse and not just be observers. And I think the public discourse and young people reframing the discourse is going to be as powerful because, as Bernie say, when online, the Angus Reid report with UBC that came out in 2021 says 68% of 18 to 35-year-old Asian youth have witnessed online hate in terms of jokes, vulgar slur, racial abuse. And 40% of them change the routine out of fear. This is a young group, this is a youth group. So when they interview someone that has just experienced Islamophobia, they begin to understand. So that kind of long-term sustainable, we believe it changes them. And it also reinforces the lack of sense of belonging to beginning to transform it into a sense of belonging. They begin to understand that racism is more than just what they experience, their racialized community experience. They begin to understand what is coalition building. They begin to understand what is solidarity and allyship. And those are immeasurable, but very sustaining values that I think through youth-focused initiative, through public education, ACNet has built education resources, so has Act to End Racism. They are very short, powerful video clips that then we develop discussion guides that help teachers talk about it because those resources are missing. They are not readily available. We are trying to unlearn racism by decolonizing and making it more and not adding to a very Eurocentric curriculum to what we call a much more multicultural curriculum. And so I just want to say that some of those work has been very uplifting. It's very optimistic because the young people, when they stand as speakers and representative of communities, then you know that some of the work that we need to do is reaping the success. The last piece of work I want to say is addressing, of course, the pipeline of leadership that starts at the young people, as school leaders, as leaders in the community, working the library, to being student council leaders, to being student trustees, to down the road, because leadership is nurtured so that when they grow and join the employment, they are then leaders. I would say the absence of leadership is not only in the Asian community, there's the absence of leadership for Indigenous in public education, for Black leaders, for leaders that have Muslim background, the intersectionality, and those kind of absenteeism doesn't allow for understanding of the rest of the employment and the employees in that organization. So those are some of the work that's very intentional, very targeted, and why we are working in that area with young people.
Thank you so much, Genling. I think the focus on young people is I think of great concern to many of us. In fact, on the Canadian Anti-Hate Network's website, there's an article that actually looks at the numbers of young white males who were implicated in hate crimes in this country between, I think it was 2010 and 2019. A quarter of those who were accused of hate crimes were between the ages of 12 and 17. And the numbers, 86% of them were male. So that's such a, like, something is going on there too when it comes to young people. That is extremely distressing. And then also you said, Genling, about the online space. Again, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation with the YWCA launched a campaign over the summer called Block Hate. And we had research that demonstrated how, again, young people in Canada are significantly more likely to see online hate, ages between 18 to 29 than other Canadians. And of course, racialized folks, layering on being young, being from racialized communities, seeing that kind of hate is much more common. And then one more little note of sort of factoid is the Samara Foundation did an analysis of tweets during one day during the last federal election, and the number of toxic tweets and those that involved toxicity against people's identities were extremely alarming and discourage folks from our communities that are more likely to experience that kind of hate from participating in civic life. Because of course, we know that women are facing misogyny, but then of course, layering on that racism that we're talking about tonight, again, a way for people to feel, not able to participate in all the ways that they can and that we know that we want people to. So really important points. Thank you so much for that. And I'm just about to get to Wati and Aisha, but I just want to do a quick time check. We're coming up to already near the end of our time together, and I have a few questions that are coming in. If anyone else has any other questions, please pop them in the Q&A. We'll do our best to get to them. But Wati and Aisha, as we round out this part of the conversation, I know that Sisters, we all know that Sisters Dialogue has taken a focus on being victim-centered. And you talked to it a little bit at the beginning of the panel. Can you both elaborate on what a victim-centered approach looks like when it comes to offering support to racialized women who are victims of hate incidents or indeed crimes in their communities?
Thank you, Amira. And I'll take on this question. And I just want to say, just to hearing what Genling said earlier, a lot of the points are really touch a point with me, and maybe we can connect later to find out the work that you're doing and how we can do it here as well. And to Amira's question, in Edmonton, in the discourse of anti-Islamophobia, we've seen a lot of focus on, stemming hateful ideology or looking at systemic and structural issues, and which these are all much needed, right? But what is lacking is often and often neglected is a victim-centered approach. And what we mean by victims are not those not necessarily those that are directly impacted by the hate crimes or Islamophobia, but those who are also vicariously and indirectly impacted. And especially in Edmonton with the increasing Islamophobic incidences. And if you see from the attacks that's been happening in Edmonton and what's been reported in the media, you notice that most of the women, they wear hijab, and the majority of them are Black. So for Muslim women it's an attack on their identity, right? So, and this is making us, a lot of women, we're grieving, we're angry, we're anxious, we're afraid. We have a lot of women reaching out to us with all these emotions, and oftentimes there's no way that, the harms of mental health and the sense of safety is not being addressed. So Sisters Dialogue, we took the lead on this. We took the lead and we reached out to all levels of government, and it's through our own advocacy work that we will be able to get funding from the provincial government, because no such grant actually exists for Muslim women specifically. So right now we're able to provide free referrals to culturally appropriate therapists for Muslim women, and also for practitioners, women who are helping other women in these situations. And we also send out care packages to women who are being attacked. We've had healing circles, and that's why I like what Genling was saying earlier, because our next step will be to have healing circles with post-secondary students, so that they will be at an earlier age, they will be given the strategies on how to deal with the trauma as they grow up, and seeing their own identity being attacked and having to deal with. We see it in women who are older in the community, and I think there's value in them learning it at a young age. And so those are some of the things that we're doing. And one other thing that we're working on also with the Edmonton Federation of Community Leagues is a Safe Walk program. I mean, it's unfathomable that we need a Safe Walk program. Like, women should be free and safe to walk in their communities, but as it is right now, simple activities, which for women to go for walks, they're not able to. So we've had allies reach out, and we're going to pilot this program, hopefully, in the coming spring, where women can schedule walks in the community, so that they can do these things without fear. And in doing such programs, what we're doing is we're also reclaiming spaces which have been unsafe for women, public safe spaces to make it safe for women. So this is what a victim-centered approach looks like to us. It's because when Muslim women, we feel seen, we feel heard and cared for, our sense of safety and well-being will drastically improve. And we need more programming and funding in this regard. So like in the discourse, when we talk about hate, racism, Islamophobia, I just want that there's more focus on the victims as well, because I see it firsthand, women coming to me and seeking mental health help, and hopefully with more awareness about this, that we can get more funding and more supports for programs like that Sisters Dialogue is doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wati. For sure, I think what you're identifying is community groups on the ground being able to identify those gaps. And it's, I think it's a real testament to the importance of this work when you realize that if it wasn't for local grassroots-based groups and community volunteers, many folks are volunteers doing this type of support, and it's very difficult to find the capacity building and the funding to do it. But without those important folks out there making those connections, a lot of times, these types of incidents will go not only unreported, but without any support. The victims at the heart of this won't have the support. And the implications I mentioned earlier, not only to the victim, their family, their children. Sometimes children are witness to these things, and again, it's just heartbreaking when families have to explain also to their children, the horrible incidents that do happen and then do get the headlines. I remember when my son came across like the Globe and Mail the day after the horrific attack in London, and I was trying to avoid, he's only 8 years old, I was trying to avoid having to talk to him about it because I didn't, I think one thing I didn't want to do was, create that sense of fear and insecurity in his heart about an identity that he holds. And I know that that is often very difficult because, as I mentioned, and many of you are saying, we're all working to try to create the right conditions or better conditions for people to be able to fully participate. But at the same time, like we're constantly in almost a reactive mode, right? We're reacting to the negativity. And you almost don't get the attention that's required until something deeply horrific, is in front of us. And it's really unfortunate that it takes that. A few questions that are coming in from the audience. This one for Leslie. Leslie, one of our participants is asking, with the app that you talked about, can you describe, what happens, when the complaints are coming into the app? What sort of follow-up then happens, or what happens to talk to those people who've taken the time to let you know what they've experienced, and how has that been developing?
Sure, thanks for that question. First of all, it's an app that's actually downloadable to a person's phone, and so they would just type in their complaint. But when we're dealing with elders who aren't, app savvy, we're happy to take a phone call and report that and put that into the app ourselves. So what we're going to do with that information, I mentioned, is that we're going to come out with a general report in January, and this is just going to be our first report saying, we've had 7,000 people reporting racism, Indigenous people reporting racism in BC. And we will talk about some of the prevalent issues and points of racism. Like one of the issues that we're constantly dealing with is people are assuming if we're Indigenous, then we're drunk. And so we might be walking in with diabetes or with heart disease, and we might be staggering for any kind of medical reason. And we get treated as if we're either seeking drugs or we're drugged up or we're drunk. And so that's a really horrible negative stereotype that really, really negatively impacts our healthcare. So we know that we're going to see a lot of those kinds of reports in there. But what we're interested in is where and how are they happening? And to what degree did they impact a person's healthcare? And so what we can do with that information, I mean, there's so many ways, as you know, with apps, there's so many ways to gather and collect information and anonymize, ensure the anonymity of the clients. But we can actually give people, an anonymous email address. So we never know who they are, but we can be in contact with them. So with those really horrific, egregious acts of racism in the healthcare system and, acts of hatred, we know that we can anonymously contact that person and ask them if they're willing to be part of a group, for example. So if we have a doctor or a nurse where we see constant complaints, and we know as Indigenous people, we know where they are. We know which hospitals to avoid in BC. We know which ones to drive right by because they're that racist, and it's safer to, risk your life for 45 minutes driving to the next town to get to a safer hospital. And so, we'll be able to take those instances and perhaps even negotiate with those hospitals about making sure that the people who are seeing constant complaints about are getting some proper training, or that they're being watched, or their behavior is being addressed. And so that's what we can do with the app. I mean, there's many opportunities for us to take this information and break it down and aggregate it in so many ways. But there's also ways for us to take that information back to the health authorities and say, look, here are your hotspots in your health authority. And they've always been suspected by us as Indigenous people, but now we're able to confirm. And for us, that's almost every emergency room in BC, to be frank, but there's certainly more other areas. So we're really looking forward to developing that. And in the background, we're able to develop more information so that that person who has recorded on their app where they had a racialized experience or experience of hate, they can see that other people have also made complaints about that same area. And so they can say, oh, okay, so it's not just me, it's other people having these same kinds of experiences. And then we can offer to those people if they want, and still retaining their anonymity, do they want to have a conversation around these issues? Because you know, you're all Indigenous, you're all in this community, you all went to this hospital or this doctor or whatever and had this clinic and had this experience. And we see a clear pattern here. And would you like to work with us to help address it? So those are the options and opportunities with the Safe Space app.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for that. It's just such a fascinating project. Well, we're almost at time already. The night has gone by so fast. We actually got another comment that I'll just reference, and it's a really sweet one. In fact, one of our participants is saying, you know, that everything she's heard tonight is really inspiring her, and that there may be folks on this call who want to donate or support some of your organizations and some of the efforts that you're doing. And so what we are going to make sure to do in our follow-up email or thank you email is include links to each of the organizations that are doing really important work, to encourage folks not only to donate if they can, or to sign up for newsletters, see how they can learn more about the work and look for more opportunities to learn, unlearn, and advance these issues. So we're out of time, and it's been such a pleasure to be on this call with everyone and to hear all of this important work that's underway. We honestly would need another full hour, I think, to get even deeper. So please do stay tuned for work from the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, from MacEwan University, and all of the incredible organizations and individuals represented here today. I just want to thank you all. Thank you so much. We're going to continue to do this work. I hope you all have a very wonderful and safe evening. Thank you.